Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. So this is the class for this week on Verity Spott's trans manifestos. As I said in the introduction video, I was originally planning to do this class kind of half on Spott and half on Preciado, but I felt like it made sense to focus more on Spott. Because Preciado is available very easily in French, and the book was originally written in French, and B, because I thought you would be more likely to be familiar with Preciado already. So I wanted to give you something new for the main focus of the class. But nonetheless, as you'll see, we're gonna use some points from Preciado kind of in the first section of the class in order to maybe frame some of the points that we'll talk about when it comes to engaging with the Spott text that I sent you, that I put on eCampus and that we're reading for this week. Okay, so we'll just start with a bit of info about Verity Spott. Born in 1987, and she's a contemporary poet who is based in Brighton, which is on the south coast of the UK, about an hour's train ride away from London. And yet she's quite well known within a kind of avant-garde, what we could call an avant-garde poetry circle. So a poetry circle which is often quite experimental in its form, which shies away from big name publications, and which engages with, I guess, kind of left-wing, quite serious left-wing political issues. And these are all possible features of what might be called an avant-garde. They're not necessary features of what might be called an avant-garde. But this particular section of poetry in the UK, and this particular group of UK poets are often spoken about as if they represented a kind of avant-garde. And some of them would use that term to describe themselves, some of them wouldn't. I don't think that Spott herself would describe herself as an avant-garde poet, but nonetheless, that is how she is described. And I think if we were going to think about where she fits into the landscape of poetry within the UK and within the world at the moment, then it's useful to think of her as someone who is amongst a number of poets who reject certain elements of what we might call the poetry establishment, which involve, or some of which might be, a desire for fame, a desire for individual achievement, and a attempt to produce kind of clean or very polished work. I feel as if Spott's work and other work associated with the avant-garde of this period is it's deliberately risky. It's deliberately unfinished a lot of the time, which is not to say that there isn't a lot of craft behind it. But I mean, if we just look at the manuscript for Trans Manifestos, we can see that the font is quite aggressive and quite abrasive. And it's published by, sorry, these are all my highlights. It's published by a press called Shit Valley, which is a small press that used to be based in Cambridge, but is now, they don't publish anymore under that name. And if we look at the biography, this is all a joke. This is not actual information about Spott, other than the final lines, which list some of her other books, and these books were published. But this information that she was born in Burnham Market, which is a market in the south of England, that she won an award to Cheltenham Ladies College, which is a very affluent and we could say posh but upper class educational institution, and that she holds a singing prize named after Edwina Hart, and that she won the Poetic Restraining Order Cup. A restraining order is something that is passed against someone in order to prevent them from making contact with or being in the proximity of another person. And again, this is a joke. And the idea that her strong subjects, so I'll make some notes for you guys. Restraining order is a legal judgment stating that someone cannot be in another person's presence or come within a certain distance of them. And strong subjects, it's like the language of a school report. So when the teachers write to the parents about a child's performance in school, so all of this tone is a joke, and it's a joke about what we might call careerist poets. So a careerist is someone who focuses on their own personal ambition, and we could say someone who instrumentalizes their output or their art for the sake of progressing their own career. And Spott's kind of fake biography is a joke about poets and artists who try to forward their own careers through their art and through their through what they put. Instead of being committed to making good art or making interesting art, they treat poetry as a way of becoming more famous or as a way of getting certain jobs. And Verity, Spott, is satirizing this. And then we have a move which is very characteristic of Spott's writing, in which we move from kind of a joke to something very, very, in some ways, very, very sincere, but also quite ridiculous. She is committed to combating evil in all its forms, its roots, annihilating its roots, and purging its contents and remnants. It's a very hyperbolic statement. To be hyperbolic is to deliberately exaggerate for literary effect. I guess there's a French word that is very similar, but I don't know for certain what it is. So I thought I would just define it for you here. So I thought I would draw attention to this just as an example of the way in which Spott's kind of status within something like an avant-garde really informs her writing and informs the physical objects that she produces with her books, and also the ways in which she describes herself. And this is not something which is unique to her, but it is something which is very much a part of her work. And another feature of this group of poets and of avant-gardes all over the world is this sense that how you produce work, how you produce the physical books that you're reading from, and the conditions in which you read them are all as important as the actual quality of the writing itself. And I say here, this will make more sense as we go through and we read the texts. But I say that something like, Trans Manifestos expresses the objective restrictions which gender non-conforming people experience. I do think that Spott, as a trans poet, as someone who does not have the gender which she was assigned at birth, she her poetry does often create a sense of being restricted, and of being restricted down to a very, very small, or of being restricted very intensely down to a very, very down to the most minimal point. And we'll see this in the manifestos. But at the same time, she is also a writer who has a real, I call it utopian, but we can just think about, there's a sense of something beautiful in everyday life in Spott's work, and it does something which wants to make us aware of, wants to make us alive to the possibilities of the world as it exists and as we see it, and it wants to bring into our view, as much as it's critiquing the ways in which gender is enforced and the effects that this has on a person's experience of the world. It's also quite committed to a kind of emancipatory vision too, I think, and the contradictions and the contrasts between these two things can be very, 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 very powerful. And we see in the manifestos how Spott combines a kind of lyrical energy, a kind of poetry. There are pages that look very much like poetry, and there are pages that look very much like prose in trans manifestos and in all of Spott's writing. And she engages with existing theory on gender and the terminologies of theory on gender. One of the big terms which is important for trans manifestos is the idea of transition, as we'll see when we move through the text itself. And she engages with this, but she also challenges it, and she exposes some of the, what we might call the presuppositions, which are the assumptions of an argument. Are the assumptions that an argument makes. Which it is not aware of, or often which it is not aware of. So Spott also wants to think about how some of the ways in which gender is written about, even by sympathetic people, how they reinforce certain unacceptable elements regarding what gender is or what it might be, and also how they what it is that they don't see about themselves, and about the kinds of things that they assume about the world. And as I said, transition is one of the things which really comes in for a kind of attack in Spott's trans manifestos, but there are other things too, and hopefully we can see them as we go through the text. And finally, this is something that we'll draw attention to too. There's a kind of deliberately contradictory, or there are some deliberately contradictory elements of trans manifestos, and there are also some spontaneous elements too. There are some elements which feel as if they've been written very quickly. There are some parts of this text which feel as if they've been written very quickly and not revised. And Spott says this in her introduction to the text, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But yeah, all of this, I focus on form, this idea that the form that you write in and the form that you publish in are as important as the content of what you're writing. All of this runs through Spott's work in clear and significant ways, and we'll talk about the effects that it has throughout the class. As I said, though, I think it's worthwhile putting Spott in conversation with other queer writers around the subject of gender. And I thought that I would do that through looking at Preciado's Testo Junkie. And as I say, I'm sure it's probably a text with which a number of you are familiar. If it's not a text with which you're familiar, then I would guess that you have a sense of who Preciado is as a writer. I know that he's quite a I guess you could almost describe him as a kind of public intellectual, which is someone who is I'm sure there's a similar term in French, but someone who is well known amongst the population, makes media appearances and things like that. I remember seeing Preciado giving interviews during COVID, for example, talking about the lockdowns, talking about the pandemic. And yeah, I got the sense that he is someone who has a kind of public intellectual role in France. Obviously, not everyone likes him, not everyone agrees with him, but nonetheless, he's someone who you might see on the TV or on a podcast. You might listen to on a podcast. So we can, as I say, just let me get my breath. We can think about some of the things that come up in Testo Junkie, which is a book which is both a kind of diary of Preciado's experiences of taking testosterone as a hormone supplement and the effects that has on his body, on his thinking, and on his gender, and also a kind of theoretical work in the traditions of Foucault about the history of gender and the way that capitalism and especially industries around hormones and industries around pharmaceuticals have played a role and continue to play a role in defining and in underpinning what one assumes to be, or what one may assume to be, quote unquote, natural gender relations. And part of Preciado's argument throughout Testo Junkie is that these natural gender relations are not natural at all. Cis people who consider themselves to be who consider their gender to be natural, or who consider their gender, we could say, to be unmediated, to be simply a result of how they were born, are as much a product of a capitalist pharmaceutical industry and of the history of pharmaceuticals, which, as with Lemmy and Miller in week 1, Preciado traces back to colonial relations. Cis people are as much a product of this kind of industry and of this history of the industrial development of hormones as gender non-conforming people are. So there is no gender for Preciado, and I think for Spott too, outside of the history of this kind of this pharmaceutical industry, essentially, and of pharmaceuticals, and of the ways in which capitalism has mediated and continues to mediate everyone's body, or more or less everyone's body. So we'll just start with some quotations which I thought were useful for how we can then go on and read Spott's work. So, from page 116 to 117 of Testo Junkie, we have this statement: the prevailing programming of gender operates with the following premise. The prevailing is the one that dominates. To prevail, the prevailing program is the program, that dominates, just like which would be the dominant way of doing things. An individual is a healthy body, is a sex, is a gender, a sexuality, is a private property. So we have this sense that for Preciado, when we talk about a person, we talk about a healthy body. We talk about a body that somebody would want to be in, and that body has a sex and a gender, and because it has a gender, it has a sexuality, and there's a close relationship for Preciado between the fact of sexuality and private property, the capacity to own things. So in some way, we could talk about private property here as just referring to the integration of a person into an economy, into a capitalist economy or a capitalist society. If we remember again back to Bad Gays, this something that they criticize or something that they describe as being a major limitation of the history of queer movements, especially in the 20th century, is the tendency to move towards private property and integration primarily amongst white middle class queer couples. As the endpoint, as the goal of what queer politics wants to have and what it should demand. And Preciado is kind of containing this idea within this and suggesting that once you have there's something about having a fixed sexuality which enables you to integrate and then to take the final step, which is the ownership of private property. And in Bad Gays, they have that joke about how even when being gay comes with an apartment and a dog, it's still a pathology. That's what they say. But Preciado goes on to say, and I think this is something that we'll come back to and that we can really see at work in Spott, is that constructing gender, as Butler argued, amounts to taking the risk of dismantling it. So there's always something that happens in the process of constructing a gender, in the process of producing gendered subjects, which enables the dismantling of gender at the same time, which in some way draws attention to the constructed nature of gender. And once you've drawn attention to that, then it becomes conceivable that you could deconstruct it. And he says, producing gender implies a collection of strategies of naturalization / denaturalization and identification / de-identification. So naturalization means to make something appear natural, when in fact it is historical. It is historical, or it is /historically mediated. What I mean by that is that naturalization covers over the process, or it's a term for the covering over of the historical process that has gone into making something what it is. So the example that Preciado gives later, and that we'll look at in a few minutes, is this idea that cis females, so females with the gender which they were assigned at birth, because of the proliferation of the pill and other kind of hormone-based treatments, these individuals are as much a product of the history of capitalist pharmaceuticals as trans people are, as gender non-conforming people are, and as people who may maintain a gender position which is not that which they were assigned at birth. But a process of naturalization covers over this historical element of what it means to be a cis female, and simply presents it as being natural, as being normal. And denaturalization is to make something that appears natural appear to be to make something that appears natural appear to be historical. So yeah, to denaturalize it, to draw attention to the historical elements of what is going on, of what constitute. To draw attention to the historical elements that constitute something or someone, someone's identity. So yeah, so again, Preciado is arguing that when you construct gender, you also run the risk of deconstructing it. When you naturalize something, you also have to denaturalize other things. When you make the dominant choice appear to be between one of two possible sexualities, which then leads into the capacity, or which seems to lead naturally to the capacity to possess private property, you denaturalize, or you get rid of perhaps a sense of communal identity or a communal selfhood, one which is not purely grounded on an individuality or on one single healthy body. And this process is happening simultaneously, naturalizing some things, naturalizing other things. And Preciado says that drag king, people gendered as female dressing as men, and performing a male identity very obviously and very evidently. So not trying to pass, quote unquote, but trying to almost parody and pastiche the identity of men, and what he calls hormonal self-experimentation. And he says these are two derailment strategies, and to derail something is to knock it off course, to interrupt it. Literally, a train is derailed, so if it comes off the tracks. So Preciado is suggesting that the process of naturalization also presents the capacity for a process of denaturalization, and that it enables these moments of denaturalization. And we can move on from this idea that gender involves risk, that the construction of gender involves the risk of the deconstruction of gender. And this idea of risk is going to be something that we can see immediately in Spott's poetry, to an idea of power. And as I say, Preciado is a Foucauldian, so he is very much used to speaking and writing in the language of power. But he says power is located not only in the female, childlike, or non-white body as a space traditionally imagined as prediscursive and natural, but also in the collection of representations that render it sexual and desirable. In every case, it remains a body that is always pharmacopornographic, a techno-living system that is the effect of a widespread cultural mechanism of representation and production. So this idea of representation and production is something which we will see at work in Spott's poetry too. And I think really what the reason that I wanted to draw attention to this citation, pharmacopornographic is Preciado's own term to describe what he considers to be the dominant way through which we can understand society. Personally, I'm not sure, but it serves its purpose in Preciado's text. The concept serves its purpose in Preciado's text. But what I wanted to suggest is that there is no this idea of a body which is prediscursive and natural is challenged, and instead we have all bodies as in some way being what he calls a techno-living system. So a system which is mediated by the technology of representation and is mediated by the cultural systems through which bodies are represented, both as images and through which they're kind of spoken about and made desirable. So yeah, there's no body outside of the mechanism of representation and production. And again, we'll see some of the things that Spott does with this. There are moments in Spott's poetry, I think, where she tries to, or even where she does, quite strongly suggest that the idea of an inside, the idea of an essence, can still be very interesting and generative for people interested in emancipatory gender politics. But at the same time, it would be extremely naive, I think she thinks, to assume that you can ever really access that in an unproblematic or unmediated way. So again, this is something to bear in mind when we go on to read Spott. And finally, 2 points to end our consideration of Preciado with, or to end the way in which Preciado might introduce our consideration of Spott. First of all, I think is a question of something like class and race and the distribution of technologies. So she says, the same testosterone that helps turn the wheels of the Tour de France serves to transform the bodies of F2M transsexuals, so female to male transsexuals. So when we hear about male cyclists taking testosterone supplements in order to increase their endurance and their speed, we might consider that to be an unfair thing to do because it gives them an advantage. Maybe, I mean, personally, I don't care that much, but it's generally frowned upon for sports people to take hormone supplements, which will give them an advantage over people who aren't taking hormone supplements. But we don't usually think of it as being a big challenge to the idea of gender itself. If a man who is associated with the hormone testosterone that is synthetically produced takes synthetically produced testosterone, we don't often consider that to be, or Preciado is suggesting that the dominant way of looking at things would not consider that to be a challenge to the idea of gender. But when transsexual people gain access to the same hormone, they do something very different. They do provoke a kind of challenge to gender, but it's the same hormone. So the question is, who has access to the same thing, which can either go unquestioningly into the bodies of men, or can produce a kind of controversy or an epistemological question when it goes into the bodies of women, and then or goes into the bodies of people who were gendered women at birth. And then, how do class and race modify the distribution of, and I would also add on to this, how we respond to, or how social discourse responds to the use of hormones by people. So why is it more controversial or why is it more of a talking point for a working class person not assigned a male gender at birth to take hormones, to take to take synthetically produced testosterone than it is for someone who is assigned male at birth. The hormone itself is the same thing, is the same product in both cases. So again, this question of class is something that I really wanted to draw attention to. Class and race, and the way that social relations modify the meaning of what it means to be cis and what it means to be trans. And one way of thinking about social relations, always, I would argue, is the question of access to resources. In fact, I would even write this on here. I would say social relations is very connected to is the question of access to resources. By who, for who, etc. So it should be by whom and for whom. Okay, and the final thing, which is what I've said earlier, final quote from Testo Junkie before we go into looking at Verity Spott's poetry for the final half hour or so, is this idea that femininity, or what Preciado calls biofemininity, is produced in the West, which means, yeah, it's the product of technologies and of cultural patterns and cultural production. And it does not exist without a whole array of media and biomolecular technologies. So this idea that to be feminine, to be a cis woman, to be female, you can't separate that from a whole series of representations, which, again, are historical, which are not natural. And again, cis females, like hormones, are modern industrial artifacts, techno-organisms from the capitalist colonial laboratory. So we can describe Preciado, I think, as maybe we could describe his tone as maybe being polemical, which means that it's something which is deliberately strong in tone, or making a potentially exaggerated point for rhetorical effect. That said, I think he's right. And yeah, something that we don't have time to go into in a lot of detail, but throughout Testo Junkie, those of you who have read it already, like I say, the contraceptive pill plays a very significant role in the history that that Preciado discusses, and this is the result of hormonal technology that goes back to colonial relations, goes back to the construction, the discursive construction of a certain idea of femininity, and it's a result of technology. So this idea that cis females who may, and certainly females who a conservative gender position would describe as quote unquote being natural or being real, women, they are absolutely the product of historical technologies, from the potential contraceptive technology that they make use of in their lives to the way in which the very idea of being female functions. Which is not to say, I don't think there's a moral judgment here. I don't think there should be a moral judgment here. But it's just, the point is that to make a distinction between a gender non-conforming person who engages in hormone treatment or takes hormones, to make a distinction between that and someone who does not appear to be a product of the same kind of hormone technology as a gender non-conforming person who has changed the gender that they were assigned at birth, or who has taken hormones. that distinction doesn't really make sense because everyone is in some way enmeshed within and is a product of this industrial history of hormone use. So yeah, it's what he means by this this sense of being modern industrial artifacts or techno-organisms. And again, I would say, there's a fair amount of jargon in Preciado, which is theoretical terminology specific to a field. It often implies questionable use or value. So yeah, Preciado has a lot of what we would call theoretical jargon. But I think the point he's making is sound, as much as he makes it polemically, and he makes it he uses these concepts like techno-organism and biofemininity. I think it's doing something. So yeah, okay, we're gonna move now in the final half hour or so to consider Spott's writing itself. Again, unfortunately, as with the Wieners class, we don't have time to look through all of it, but I can draw your attention to some of the things that I think are very interesting about this book, and we can, hopefully you can read it in detail on your own too. So, to go back to this idea of risk and this idea of spontaneity, which I foregrounded as being a kind of avant-garde quality, but also something that Preciado foregrounds, we have this, I guess, a preface or an introduction in which, first of all, Spott describes these pieces as attempted essays and manifestos. So she doesn't describe them as being finished, and she doesn't necessarily describe them as being successful. So there's already an idea that there is something valuable, or there is something worth publishing and maintaining in an attempt that fails, even in something that perhaps does not do what it set out to do. There is still something of significant value. And maybe of more significant value than something which is perfect and something which is finished. And we hear it does not pretend to be completed, and it believes that its life is in its capacity for change, movement, and instability. And life is a word that comes up a few times in this pamphlet or this book. And yeah, there's something about publishing these texts as unfinished, as in some ways still being written, as something that could be thought about by the reader as being still alive, because they were never perfect, they were never perfected, they were never finished, which is an essential quality of what it is that Spott wants to express with these texts, And she says these manifestos are described as such because at the time of their composition, they felt like attempts at preservation of life and of the capacity to struggle against life. And I think that this is really interesting and important. We talked about how Spott might employ, or does employ, contradiction. She employs words which perhaps mean one thing in one context and one thing in another context. And this sense that life is something which, in this way, appears positive. An attempt at preservation is also a sign of life. If we are attempting to preserve ourselves, we are staying alive. There's something in us which is not giving up, which has not, we could say, acquiesced, which I need to spell right, which means to accept something. So if we are still alive, then we have not acquiesced to a certain situation, I think is what this is suggesting. But at the same time, life is immediately presented as something to struggle against. So life is something that can be either maybe an essential core of who we are that needs to be preserved in the face of something which is overwhelming, but also something. There's another way of understanding life, which is as something that we actually struggle against, that we need to preserve ourselves against. And the dual meaning of this, of life, and the way in which Spott does not distinguish between this dual meaning. She doesn't tell us what she means in either case. I think is very significant for the kind of contradictions that the book is going to explore. And she says again, they are improvisations written in moments of stress and tension. They have not been heavily edited and they are untidy. We're not sure what we are. Is Verity Spott referring to herself in the third person here, which is something that people may do? Is she is this for a moment the voice of the manifestos themselves, saying we're not sure what we are? Or, like Wieners, is Verity establishing, is Spott, sorry, we're friends, so I keep calling her Verity, but is Spott establishing a kind of community with the reader and her here? Are we all not sure what we are really deep down? And if we're not sure what we are, is that something that demands that there are texts out there which are also not sure of what they are, and which also move and express themselves in fragmentary ways, and which are unfinished and which need to be written in moments of stress and tension in order to express such stress and tension. And we have perhaps a second preface, perhaps a poem here in which she says, to be sure, if I am affected by what does not yet appear to me as a thing, it is because laws, corrections, and even structures of meaning govern and condition me. That order, that glance, that voice, that gesture, which enact the law for my frightened body. So we have a sense here, and I think this is a sense which I mentioned when we were just talking about Preciado, and which I think runs through Verity's experience in these poems, is that there is a body which in some basic level is, if not prediscursive, is experienced as being separate from the laws, connections, and structures of meaning that govern it. But this body, within Spott's writing, and I think that this is something worth thinking about, is almost always only ever experienced in a state of heightened fear or tension or stress or vulnerability. Vulnerability, we could say. It's not a body which can stride out into the world. So to stride out is to walk confidently forward. But it is a body which somehow, because of its vulnerability to laws, connections, and structures of meaning, is still separate from them. But it knows that separation on a basic level because of its vulnerability to these structures of meaning. And there's no sense, I think, that this body can properly exist without those structures of meaning which threaten it and which frighten it. But there is a sense that in some way, on some somatic level, Spott experiences her body as different. Which is not to say that it's what Preciado would describe as pre-discursive, but I do think there is something here which can draw our attention to a state of being which is potentially, at least, or in which the body potentially, at least, feels separate from the laws and the meanings which are determining it. I'm just going to focus on the prose sections of this for the last 20 minutes. The poetry, I think, is very beautiful, but it's not something that we have too much time to go over. So by all means, develop your own readings of the poems. And I think something that we can do as we read this prose, or something that I thought it would be useful to do, would be to talk. So there's a couple of things that I can do. One of them is to look at the ways in which Spott, as I said, interrogates some of the key terminology of the way in which gender and changing gender and trans and gender non-conforming experience is discussed, and also explain some of the references that are in this book. And there's some references to some very specific UK things. So we'll try and do that for the next section, or for the final section of the class. So yeah, this is the first manifesto, and it begins with this statement that the trans community, in inverted commas, suggesting that the community is perhaps not as stable or as consistent as it's spoken about as being, is confused as its components. Wrapped in the umbrella narratives of LGBTQ, more narratives are at play within the T. The media organs are obsessed with our bodies, and they want them changed, dismantled, rebuilt, destroyed, because they want us to detest them as much as they do. So we immediately have, I think, a pretty accurate sense, at least within the UK, that there is a really significant amount of transphobia in the media, and this is something which trans people face on an absolutely daily basis. And there is this sense of hatred is something which Spott writes about a lot, both in trans manifestos, but also in her other writing too. And I think there's quite a thick sense of the hatred of the establishment for trans people, which we could say bears out in the statistics around all kinds of negative effects that come from transphobia within the UK. And then she goes on to criticize the popularity of an idea of dysmorphia or of dysphoria, and she describes it as a liberty bell, which here I think we can mean as like it's a way of achieving freedom. A way of achieving freedom. So it's something which is presented as a kind of solution, as a way out of the situation that gender non-conforming people find themselves in, is to admit a kind of dysphoria, to admit a kind of dysmorphia, and in that way pathologize yourself, right? In that way make yourself into someone who has a condition that can then be treated. And we talked again in the first class with Lemmy and Miller, the extent to which homosexuality becomes reincorporated within a dominant sexual heterosexual framework through pathologization, through making people into subjects who are ill and subjects who can then, as a result, be treated. And she goes on to say that it's only a part-way saver, so it doesn't really get you out. It will hurt a hell of a lot. And she says the metro for beige tolerance. The metro is a free newspaper circulated on the London Underground and buses, known for being boring and having reactionary views. So when she says it's like the metro, she's like, it's boring, but it's also reactionary. Dysmorphia, being made to admit dysmorphia, treating yourself as if you have a pathological condition, as if you are ill in some way, and then seeking treatment, is like the metro. It's just like tolerance. It's the most boring form of integration, and it's something which Spott is suggesting involves violence. Is something which involves doing violence to one's own self, because it's something which necessarily means that one is denying something more true or more like life about one's experience of gender and gender nonconformity. Yeah, and I think Spott quite emphatically wants to reject the idea that dysmorphia, admitting dysmorphia or pathologizing oneself, is a solution. And then from here, she goes in to talk about this notion of transition, which I've said is something that recurs throughout the work. And I think probably in this class we'll only really have time to look at the way that she writes about transition. But she says trans supposes transition. So supposes here means assumes. Trans assumes that there is a transition going on. But where is the transition from and to? Changing gender does not mean changing body. And then she goes on to say, if you want to change body, you should be allowed to tear out its sides, the sides of the law, the walls of language, the surface of liquid. So we can deal with this in two parts. So first of all, this idea that transition involves moving from and to somewhere, as if there's always an end point, as if at some point the transition will stop and you will settle back into a fixed gender, which may be different from the gender that you had at birth, but will still be a recognizable gender. Spott wants immediately to question this, wants immediately to make the reader begin to reject this idea that to be gender non-conforming means to move from one gender to another. And she says later, we are not in transition. We are in occupation. It's about, for them, for Verity, for Spott, sorry, it's about holding a line somewhere. It's about occupying a space which is within neither element of the gender boundary. And it's a deliberately militarized term. They are holding it against enemies, against people who want them to leave, and against people for whom they are offensive. And to occupy I know we have to move through, like I say, the whole text is contradictory. It moves in ways which, if we were to read the whole thing straight through, it would push us in a whole bunch of different directions at once. So really all I can do is give you a bit of a through line. But yeah, we have this sense that the occupiers were evicted by force. So we talk about occupying rather than transitioning, occupying a space which people don't want you to occupy. But then this reads like an eviction from a squat or from a house, right? People being violently evicted from somewhere that the law says that they should not be. So Spott moves from a register which appears to be about gender to one of space. So she takes the transition as a movement from one space to another and says, no, it's an occupation of one particular space. And then she suggests that anything which is occupying the space is evicted. The occupiers were evicted. And this sounds like a news report as well. So it sounds like something that has happened that is maybe coming out of the banal media institutions, the Metro, for example, which we know that Spott has also said detest the bodies of trans people. And again, in the final section of this, we have this sense that the force which is evicting people is a social force, but it might not be a social force which is evident to people who are not in the same position as the author or as members of the trans community, because we don't hear that trans people were murdered, which, as I'm sure you guys know, happens with astonishing degrees of regularity around the world. But rather we hear that they committed suicide. 41% of trans people commit suicide. There's, through lining up these two sentences, what Spott does is suggest that the thing that drives trans people, 41% of trans people, to suicide, demands to be understood as a kind of social force, as a kind of social pressure, which makes continuing life as being trans and continuing life as a trans person intolerable. But this is framed not as something sad which happens to individuals, but as the direct result of a kind of concerted social force, of a kind of violence of the state and of society itself being enacted against the body of trans people, and as a form of eviction from the space that she considers them, or from the occupation they are engaged in. And it's by moving away from transition as an idea that involves moving to and from somewhere, to a sense of gender nonconforming as occupation. And she says we should be occupying the space of social discomfort for them and not us. We should not be attempting a cunning and desperate escape, which, again, the idea of transition suggests perhaps a sneaking through, a passing through a dangerous period, but then a emerging into a space of safety. And this is what Spott is arguing against. She, at least in this manifesto, which we know is written quickly, she's arguing that this transition is something which involves risk, involves danger, involves maintaining a space against enemies. And we read later, I'll necessarily have to move quite quickly, that she does not want allies, she wants accomplices. And something which runs through this pamphlet is the adoption of a certain language, which is quite commonly used to describe gender experience and trans experience and queer experience. So, for example, the idea of the ally, which is the person who is not themselves queer, is themselves gender conforming, but nonetheless supports the struggles of queer people and of gender non-conforming people. But she's saying, I don't want that. What I want is accomplices. And an accomplice, as I'm sure you guys know, is someone who... sorry, let me spell it right. It's someone who carries out an act alongside someone. And usually criminal. If you're an accomplice to a crime, for example, you're usually not an accomplice to anything legal. So she turns quite a common and quite a neutral and quite a safe idea of being an ally, and she says, no, we need accomplices. We need people who are willing to take a risk, to engage in and to continue along with this. At this point, what is positioned as a movement of occupation, from which people may be violently evicted, and she positions the suicide of trans people as being one of the consequences of this occupation and as being a form of eviction. So the stakes are really high, we can say. And the stakes are what one can win or lose in any particular situation. So if we say the stakes are high, it means there is a lot to be won, but also a lot to be lost. And it involves a lot of risk. And it involves risk, Spott is suggesting it involves risk to one's personal body as well, and risk to one's life. And the final thing that I want to note about these pages is just this sense that, again, we spoke about the fact of being embodied is a continual reference point in Spott's work, or is a very common reference point in Spott's work. And she says, if you want to change body, you should be allowed to tear out its sides, the sides of the law, the walls of the language, the surface of liquid. And yeah, this idea that one's own body is also the sides of the law. So we can return to Preciado here, or to Butler, and to the sense that the body is continually embedded in a kind of discursive matrix which gives it meaning, and which allows it to function. And I think for Spott, the body is both a site of being frightened, and it's a site of something in some way which is resistant to the material consequences of the law that threaten it. But it's also something which is totally embedded within that law, and it's not something that one can ever separate from that law. And yeah, I'm just trying to think about how we can focus this last bit, because I have gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to. Okay, I think if we move to this section, and I'll give you a reading of this this manifesto, and then I think we will wrap up the class. And as I say, we're not able to cover everything, but I hope that it helps give you a kind of entry point into a text which I think is really fascinating and wonderful, but also certainly quite dense. But yeah, in this manifesto on page 19, Spott says, what we've been trying to do so far is establish a language that deliberately alienates anyone and anything that enforces the gender binary. So she wants to write in a way which alienates people and language and anything which enforces the gender binary. And then she goes on to say, pinpoint every harmonic lie on the map and structurally dismember them. Every word contains at least 5. So there's a sense that language itself is this is a system in which meanings in which they accrue, and we talked about this word accrue in relation to the first class and how the word homosexuality itself accrues meaning, but it means to collect over time. So language itself accrues a kind of meaning and history. And Spott goes on in this very dense, but I think very beautiful passage. I'll delete this highlight so it's easier to read. But she says, every word contains at least 5, and each 5 is an enforcement of the perceived 2, the double in parallel, one set against the other in a kind of elliptical tragedy that leaves you feeling completely paralyzed. So the sense that language itself is continually reinforcing the kind of constriction that Spott is feeling, because language itself, because words accrue meanings, because the words themselves contain more than they say, or more than you think they're saying. So when you speak, you inevitably say things that you don't mean to say, but you say them because language itself is something which says more than it means to, as a result of the fact of its history. And she says that paralysis, we decided, is stupefaction. Stupefaction is a state of being unable to speak. A state of being unable to speak because one is overwhelmed by a situation or by a situation. So she says it is an imposed stupefaction because if each word in English and in a great many other languages contains at least 5 points of harmony, and each of these 5 points is contained between two harmonic falsities, fuck, you get stuck with these 5 hammering voices barreling, echoing through your head. You feel dead in them, surrounded, lost in an attempt to decipher any vestige of truth whatsoever, confounded by the impossibility laid out by the primal stupidity of language, of bourgeois life, of protocol. There's a lot here, but I think one of the reasons why I just wanted to, I think we'll wrap up after this, but one of the reasons why I just wanted to draw attention to this part of the text is because it shows 2 things. It makes a kind of theoretical argument about what language is and the way that language is encoded with a series of meanings and of histories which mean that one is always saying more than one means to say. And because these histories are primarily histories of domination and histories of violence, they're histories of what Preciado described as a capitalist post-colonial laboratory. They're histories which involve the violent eviction of trans people from the discursive space that they occupy, which is manifest in the suicide of trans people. Language itself becomes something which is deeply frustrating. But for a poet like Spott, language is also the medium with which she communicates and with which she critiques the world, and makes art which is intended to critique the world, and in doing so to provide new opportunity and new potential. And what this does is it moves from being what sounds like a theoretical argument to being like a stream of consciousness. So we see and we hear Spott herself wrestling with these points. We hear the way in which she says it contains at least 5 points of harmony, and each of those 5 points is contained between two harmonic falsities. Fuck. And we have this interruption of a moment in which Spott's own thinking is running away with her, and it's getting too complicated, and we get a sense of her own disorientation. And you feel dead of them, dead in them, surrounded, lost in an attempt to decipher any vestige of truth whatsoever. But of course, there's an irony here, which is that that you can't stop speaking and you can't stop thinking in language. And she goes on to say that this is why so many dialogues have become lodged, so many trans dialogues have become lodged in a system of correctly assembling language in order to describe the observable. As if there's something about the way in which trans politics for Spott and the way in which what she and what Lemmy and Miller and what others would refer to as a liberal perspective on trans politics. And I said previously that a liberal is someone in English who is broadly in favor of the status quo, or it's like someone who thinks the system, the basic elements of the system work, but need a few tweaks. And at this point, Spott says symbolic violence is permanent, the entire artifice of the liberal. So there's something about being a liberal, about being broadly in favor of the way that things are, but thinking that it just needs a few tweaks, which means that one is continually involved in a kind of symbolic violence. And here we have this sense that part of engaging in trans dialogues that don't fundamentally challenge the way that social relations work, it becomes this kind of endless loop, this use of language in order to describe what is describable, but not get to anything which is really has a potential to change things. Verity, Spott wants to use language in a way which is different, and I think part of what she wants poetry to do, and part of what she thinks poetry can do, is to speak to experiences which are outside of the directly observable, which are outside of simply everyday life, and in that way speak to something about being trans which has a potential to change things more than the liberal would want, and has a potential to offer a kind of actual emancipatory framework. And yeah, there's a lot in this that I unfortunately didn't get to discuss with you guys. I think, just to end, I would suggest that this poem, again, is another example, this Against Transition Trans Manifesto on page 23, is another example of how Spott, she is interested in the body as something which is outside of the law, and as something which is outside of language, and as something which is potentially pre-discursive and gender neutral. But the way that she suggests that one can access this is always very, very ambivalent and very, very frightening and odd. And she talks about a hollow body waiting for an object or spirit to come and live in that hollow. And then she immediately goes on to suggest these are some coping strategies. So a coping strategy is something that you do. It's something that you do to help you get by or to survive. And remember, preservation is something that she talks about right in the introduction as being very important for how she's thinking about these texts in general. So we have this description of darkness, a room devoid of light, a hollow body. So something which kind of sounds pre-discursive, which sounds outside of the law. But at the same time, it's ambivalent. It's not clear what it means. Is this a description of a prison cell? Is this even something that we would want? And then she goes on to say that they're coping strategies. So maybe they're just ways of dealing with the fact that we are within the law and the fact that our bodies are coded. And as she suggests in the first manifesto that we looked at, that the sides of the law themselves are in our own bodies. So yeah, we have this contradiction throughout this writing and throughout a lot of Spott's writing, and I think that she wants to both absolutely show the manner in which the language that we use and the ways in which we are physically embodied is constituted by and constitutive of, so plays a role in bringing about a reality which a reality of social violence, which results in the fact that those who occupy the space of gender non-conforming are often evicted by force, and that as a result of which 41% of trans people commit suicide. At the same time, the body is something which contains a potential. And maybe this potential is only something which is seen when it's frightened or when it's in complete darkness, but it still exists. And the way in which Spott uses language and uses poetry to both manifest this potential and to pull back from it and to question the extent to which it's always involved in perpetuating something which we might think is bad or very, very bad. It's something that I find really fascinating about her work. And yeah, okay, guys, I know that was something which was covered a lot and quite quickly. I plan to talk more about some of these passages. I'll leave them on the PowerPoint so that you can look at them too. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed reading this. I know Spott's writing is really fascinating. There's a lot of it out there, and there's also a lot of YouTube videos in which she and which you can see her giving quite long readings from her work too. And I would really recommend looking at those if you would like to, and if you found her writing interesting, or if you found it moving or insightful. So yeah, the optional task for this week is to write a response, 1 or 2 paragraphs to trans manifestos. If you like it, or if you want to, then send it to me and I'll send you some corrections. If you would rather share it with the group, then please do so, as always. And yeah, guys, okay, so have a good week. Have a great break. I hope that you get to relax. I will post the details of the assessments by the end of the week or over the weekend, so you'll have more sense of how the course will be assessed. But it's fairly simple. And yeah, okay, I'll speak to you on a week today. So in 2 weeks. Sorry, I'll speak to you in 2 weeks when we'll be talking about Lizzie Borden's films. So yeah, okay, ciao. Have a great couple of weeks and speak to you soon. Bye.